I've had a lot of conversations about sex with people I know and people I don't know. And there is this one phrase, or at least some version of the same phrase, that I've heard again and again and again. I just want to be able to let go. Most of us want to experience sex without the internal commentary. We want to not be calculating our moves. We want to not be worried about how we look. And we don't want to manage the outcome. We want to be uninhibited. We want to feel free enough to express ourselves fully and to change our minds and to try something we've never tried before. We just want it to be real. But there is this massive gap between wanting to be uninhibited and allowing ourselves to be. And in long term relationships, we are faced with this frustrating reality that we are often more reserved and guarded with the partner that we've slept with for more than a decade than we are with someone that we barely know. Hey, lovers. This is Sex in Real Life. Honest conversations about sex and relationships beyond 40. I'm your host, Stacey Herrera. I know that you've heard the expression familiarity breeds contempt. Maybe you've heard it, familiarity breeds boredom, but we are told that over time, the excitement naturally fades. Maybe it's because of all the, domestic responsibilities, shared finances, daily routine, or whatever. But we assume that the self consciousness that keeps us guarded is physical and that we might be worried about, and this is just based on like marketing, right? The marketing tells us that we are self-conscious because of our physical bodies. We're aging or we've gained weight or we're wondering whether we're still attractive to the other person or whatever. But in my observation, which is, you could take it with a grain of salt, but in my observation, in long-term relationships, I feel like, this idea that familiarity breeds contempt, I feel like that is inadequate. Because by the time a relationship has survived, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, you have seen the messiest parts of each other, illness and grief and exhaustion and, all the realities of daily life. You don't care about the belly. You've been looking at the belly, right? Like, those things. So I feel like the thing that locks us down in long-term relationships isn't about appearance. I think that I think that it's the fear of wanting something different than whatever has become the baseline. That combined with the reality that not the reality, the truth that most of us have been holding back since the very beginning of the relationship. Now, stay with me. There is an assumption that we start off, honest. Like once we decide like this is our person, there's this assumption that we're being honest and authentic and that we gradually become repressed, by the routine of marriage or long-term partnership or whatever. But I don't know if that's accurate. I think that human behavior is more complicated than that because most people enter relationships already guarded. And I'm talking about even past that like honeymoon facade phase where you're putting on your best face. Even after the mask drops, I think that we still have a level of guarded performance and holding back that we're doing. So I don't think that I just don't buy the idea that the reservation, develops at year 7. I think that it might be present from day 1. or 3 months after, you've been seeing each other or whatever. The beginning. You know, we do not show up to a first date or to the first time we have sex with our most vulnerable sexual selves exposed most of the time. Now, there are some exceptions to this, of course, if you are if you dabble in the play community, that might be not true for you. But I'm just talking about the regular everyday stuff. Because what you do at a play party with somebody that don't know might not be what you do with your partner. So there's also that. But for the sake of this conversation, we're just talking about regular one-on-one relationship stuff. I just think that we come into these experiences trying to manage the other person's perception. We present an identity that is constructed to fit conventional social standards. So we do the thing that we think it's supposed to look like, right? Like we try on desire based on what's acceptable and what we've seen in culture rather than, actually communicating what we want or how we feel. So long-term relationships do not automatically create the inhibition, but it might solidify, the mask to a permanent fixture. That was a little clunky, but you get what I'm saying. And I think that this happens because, our identity is so much more than the roles that we play. It's easy to say that, we're restricted by being a wife or being a husband or, being parents to those kids or the jobs that we have, the professional designations and all that stuff. There is that. And those things give us the illusion of a well-oiled machine. But, our identity is bigger than that. I mean, it's a whole framework that we use to move through the world, like a defensive framework. It's our sense of self-respect, our character, our reputation. And when you are physically exposed, considering expressing an unfamiliar or a raw sexual appetite can feel like a threat to your reputation. I mean, you know, there's a little bit of anxiety about revealing your true unedited desires, because it could, and sometimes does, change how your partner views your character. So that internal hesitation, sounds like a bunch of warnings. Bump, bump, bump. If I ask for what I actually want tonight, will they look at me differently tomorrow? Will I be judged? Will they wonder if I've been faking pleasure all these years? So, to protect our standing in the relationship, we default to these controlled, conventional versions of ourselves in with regard to our sex life and sometimes with regard to our whole life. So we use the same movements and go through the same rhythm and do the same things and expressions because we have already established that those things are safe. And so we stay inside the boundaries of the character that we have established because stepping outside of that risks us looking ridiculous, or foolish, or even worse, like actually being ridiculed by the other person. And just so you know that ridicule in long-term relationships doesn't always look like somebody laughing out loud. Usually it's a lot more subtle than that. It might be a sigh, you know, it might be some hesitation or, maybe they just raise an eyebrow or say some passive aggressive comment the next morning, while you're at the coffee maker waiting on your Keurig, you know, and that sends a very clear message that it's not safe. Hmm. So, our brains are really sensitive to social rejection in general, but especially with our partner, our spouse. So, if our partner, even for a moment, hints at surprise or discomfort or dismissiveness toward some authentic expression of desire, our nervous system will register that as a threat and the defenses go up immediately. So then you start pulling back your true desire, and that guarded persona comes back. And then you just go back to their regularly scheduled program. And it becomes clear that both people, that it's safer to just be predictable, right? Both of you are thinking that. I think that, and again, I'm going to go out on a limb here, so stay with me. I think that that identity trap might explain some, not all, of the mechanics of infidelity. Not every kind of infidelity, but, sometimes when someone steps out of a long term relationship, we want to believe that they just want something new, right? A new person, a new younger body, or whatever the story is. But I think that sometimes in affairs, maybe a lot of the time in affairs, the kind of sex that is happening with this new other person is often completely different than what's happening at home. It's a lot less controlled. Maybe it's more intense. Maybe it's completely, unchoreographed because they don't know the other person. So it's rarely about like some superior physical attraction or a better body or whatever. A lot of it is just that this is a new person. And so the person that they are that shows up to their regular life doesn't exist for this new person. There's no reputation to maintain. They don't share the responsibilities, the mortgage, or any of that stuff. So the person who is cheating doesn't have to be the responsible adult. They don't have to be the practical spouse. They don't have to be the mature professional. They are allowed to start without expectations, especially if they're going into it thinking that they're not trying to mess up what they have at home. So they're not even investing in it, right? I mean, that's just my 2 cents because I just think that infidelity is almost never about finding a new person. I think that it's sometimes about trying to experience an unexpressed version of yourself. Sometimes, but not always. But looking for that unexpressed version of yourself outside of your existing relationship highlights the central conflict, right? Because you cannot experience physical freedom or emotional freedom if you're hiding, right? Especially if you're hiding from yourself. So when someone realizes that their preferences are changing, or maybe that they've always wanted a different kind of touch or a different dynamic or a different level of intensity, it means that you also have to confront your existing identity, like who you've been being, and acknowledging that you have sexual hunger that is different than what is the norm for you also means admitting that the safe you is no longer the whole story. I mean, and most of us are terrified of that kind of shift. So we repress our desires and pretend that we don't want what we want because we're just anxious and feel like what we really want might be too messy for the person we're with or for the relationship or whatever. But maybe we need to be honest about why that angsty feeling exists. And there's a lot to unpack there. But for most of us, especially, I'll just speak to Americans. Our sexual education was entirely biological and mechanical and fear based. We're taught about prevention and anatomy, but nothing about pleasure or arousal or how to articulate a complex desire. And when you lack the words to describe, your hunger, you just go silent and that becomes the default. You just stay in the bounds of what you know might be acceptable. Furthermore, furthermore, we also have a collective anxiousness around sex. We live in a society that is at present confronting the historical reality of boundary violations and sexual misconduct and abuse. And that is an absolutely necessary public conversation, but it does, you know, it can be inhibitive in private spaces because it creates, a hypervigilance around sex. And for women, if you identify as a woman, there also might be some background conditioning, around shame and puritanical standards and, or maybe you've had past experiences where you were touched inappropriately or you had someone force themselves on you. And, then there's the dialogue that has been going on forever about how, female sexual desire is inappropriate or not respectable. And if you are a man or identify as a man, the world is very focused on consent and misconduct right now for good reason. But that can also create anxiety. You might be feeling hyper vigilant about, crossing a line or causing discomfort or appearing aggressive or predatory, right? And those are all real things, but that's just an added layer to how we might be showing up. So we pull back in defense, and then our partners might misinterpret our pulling back as lack of interest when really we're just either bracing for harm or trying not to cause harm or whatever. So when both partners are, trying to monitor for threats or shame or misinterpretation, you're just in high alert all the time and you cannot surrender when your nervous system is in defense mode. And orgasms could happen, but I mean, again, sometimes, as I've said a gazillion times before, sometimes orgasms are just a response to stimulation. So it's not that they can't happen, but because orgasms are neurological, I mean, they're physical, but they're neurological, it often, like a present orgasm, a full bodied orgasm, sometimes requires the brain to stop trying to monitor logic and boundaries and social feedback. Like when the brain is working overtime for you to stay in character, you can't really have an authentically pleasurable experience. That's why I think that, a level of, I hate to use the word safety, but safety, is a prerequisite for good sex. I think that safety is not the whole picture, which is another episode, but I think that true intimacy requires both people to be allowed to evolve and shift and change. And in a relationship, mature, healthy relationship, I think that it requires an explicit agreement that sex is safe from judgment, ridicule, and weaponization. Like knowing that you can come into the experience as your whole full self without needing to worry about whether or not you're going to be on shaky ground tomorrow. I mean, this needs to be built entirely outside of the bedroom, of course, because it needs to be about the things that are said during the day. Because again, remember, foreplay is everything that happens before sex. So how we speak to each other in the kitchen dictates how safe we feel in the bedroom, metaphorical bedroom. So if you use your partner's sexual vulnerability as a joke or as ammunition in the middle of an argument about something completely different, th- or at all, actually, that's a safety violation. And then the next time you try to have sex, the defenses are going to be up. Uninhibited pleasure is messy. It doesn't fit into neat, polite boxes. And authentic desire thrives on dynamics that cultural conditioning might label as inappropriate. I mean, that could involve, power dynamics and fantasies and all kinds of stuff. Polite society wants sex to be clean and predictable, but that's not how it works. It's unruly most of the time. But in an environment where there is trust, those unconventional things between two consenting adults, those things can be explored. I mean, and consent, because of course we need to talk consent. Consent is not just a clinical tool to ensure that no one gets hurt. It is a framework that gives each party agency and freedom to, negotiate their truest preferences without fear of emotional rejection. I say emotional rejection because your preference might not gel with the other person, so they might say no to the physical part of what you want, but that doesn't mean saying no to you emotionally. Does that make sense? I hope I didn't muddy this message up. I hope I didn't muddy this message up because this is a lot, but you know, I think that there's so many unspoken choices being made between, you know, who we think we should be and who we actually are. And when that gets disrupted, when one person or both people step outside of who they've already been for so long, it could reveal a different kind of desire, I think. I'm going to share a book in the resources that I think will help with this because yes, we do need to be having conversations around consent and boundaries, and we need to be respecting people's choices. And because everything's a yes, and we also need to be able to express ourselves sexually and otherwise in appropriate settings. So check the show notes. I can't think of the name of the book right now, but I promise to drop it in the resources. If this episode made you reconsider what you think about, how you think about identity or the ways that you might be maintaining a persona or the parts that you might be hiding from yourself or your partner, pass it along. Pass the episode along, share it on your socials or, with somebody in a text message or maybe even with your partner. And if you feel so inclined, take a second to leave a review or a rating. It'll take just a few moments, but it does really ensure that these conversations are found by the people who need to be having them. Next week, we are going to wrap up our Good Sex series. That's unofficially Good Sex series, but we're going to be talking about how to keep the erotic thread alive even when sex isn't happening. Yep, you're going there. I'll see you then. Ciao.